Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 19. I Could Have Made You Mine. Once they had arrived back at the department, Detective Bataan had immediately sent out 2 detectives to arrest Albin Hurst. The theory that he had killed Agent Cortez in order to help his sister and make her appear innocent sounded absolutely plausible and definitely gave them reasonable grounds to investigate the man further. Technically, though, they still didn't have any evidence to hold both Hurst and his sister for long, and that was why Tally now stood together with Detective Bataan and Sarah in the bullpen, contemplating their next moves carefully. There's no point in interrogating Hurst. He will lure her up in no time, just like his sister did, and we won't get anything useful out of either of them. We need some sort of evidence, and we need it quickly. We cannot keep them here forever. The frustration in Detective Bataan's voice was clearly audible, and Tally felt the exact same. They knew that their theory made perfect sense, knew it was most likely what had happened, but without a confession, or at least some evidence, they were powerless. Next to her, Sarah seemed to share the general mood. She impatiently tapped her fingers on the table, then apparently came to a decision and turned towards Detective Bataan. Nikta, I know you don't want to hear it, but I think it's time, Sarah urged. I have to talk to Kara Brand eventually, and right now it looks like it's our best chance to get something out of her. Let me try and agitate her somehow. I'm sure I can throw her off. I don't know. I mean, do you really believe your sole presence will be enough to break her, after everything that she had managed to pull off so far? Detective Bataan was chewing her lower lip, looking anything but convinced by Sarah's plan. Trust me, I will give her far more than just my sole presence. I know better than anyone else what this woman and her brother are capable of. I understand the way they work. After all, I've been the leader of this investigation for ages, just in case you forgot. Sarah, that's not what I meant. I'm not questioning your abilities or your knowledge. I just don't want us to make any rash decisions. Not now. Not when we're this close to solving this mess for good. Well, care to share your options then? Because the way I see it, we don't have any. Sarah snapped back, not even trying to hide how pissed she was. The stress and pressure did not seem to do the 2 women any good, and surely but steadily, the conversation between the 2 started to heat up. For a while, Tally only stood helplessly beside them and watched their exchange quietly. For once, she could understand both sides, and she really didn't want to butt into the argument, knowing full well it could make things worse. But she also knew that if nobody would interrupt them, Detective Bataan and Sarah would keep going around in circles. Either of the 2 women was too stubborn to give in. The conversation would soon turn into a full-blown argument, and in the end, would do nothing at all to solve the issue at hand. So when she couldn't take their bickering any longer, Tally decided that enough was enough. She stepped between them, using her body to separate the 2 women, and raised her hand to silence them. She felt a bit like a parent, separating 2 fighting children, but in the end, it did the trick, and both Sarah and Bataan stopped arguing, then turned to look at her with equally confused frowns on their faces. I might have an idea. Telly sounded way more confident than she actually felt about the plan that had been starting to form in her head. She could see the doubt on Batan's face, and even though Sarah was better at hiding it, Telly knew she was skeptical as well. But Telly Craven wouldn't be where she was today when she would let this throw her off. Without hesitation, she started to explain her idea, and the longer she talked, the more attentive the two other women seemed to become. I have to admit, this is so simple that it might actually work, Batan stated plainly, once Telly had finished her explanation. It might, and it definitely won't do us any harm to try, Sarah agreed. Good call, Detective Craven. And the look of approval she sent Telly's way, pride in her eyes, her lips curling into a soft smile, made her stomach flutter immediately. She bit her lip to stop a huge, very inappropriate grin from appearing on her face, and tried her best to keep her expression completely emotionless. She was a professional detective, after all. Let's do this, Telly nodded grimly. Internally, however, she was squealing. A couple of minutes later, Telly stood together with Sarah in the hallway that led to the interrogation room. Sarah had her back turned to Telly, and was about to head into the room in which Kara Brand was already waiting for her. Telly stood motionless behind her and watched her reaching out for the doorknob. Then, within a split second, made one of those impulsive decisions she was almost sure she would regret later. Wait. The sound of her voice made Sarah hesitate, and she turned around to face Telly, her eyebrows raised in question. I want to go in there with you. Absolutely not, Sarah replied immediately, with a firmness in her voice that a couple of weeks earlier would have made Telly quiver in her boots. Now, however, she stepped closer and reached out to place her hand on Sarah's arm. We're in this together, remember? Telly. Please, she whispered, hoping that Sarah would hear some of the determination she was feeling. I need to do this. Are you sure you are ready for this? I hear the voice of this woman as soon as I close my eyes at night. I still feel the touch of her fingers on my skin. I have to face her eventually, or she will haunt me forever. I'm not saying it will be easy, but please, just let me do this. Telly tightened her grip on Sarah's arm, and her voice dropped even lower. You will be with me the whole time, and I feel safe around you, Sarah. I don't know if I'm ready, but honestly, I don't think someone can ever be truly ready for this, and knowing that you will be right by my side gives me all the strength that I need. Telly could feel Sarah hesitate. She could hear her taking in a deep breath, could watch her struggle. It was obvious that she didn't want to put Telly through this, that she didn't want her to confront the woman who kidnapped her, who could have killed her, would have killed her without even batting an eye, if she had truly wanted to. Still, she probably understood better than anyone why Telly felt like she had to do this, and didn't want to deny her the opportunity to get at least some closure. Finally, her shoulders dropped slightly, and Sarah sighed. Okay. It was just one simple word, but to Telly, it meant the absolute world. She knew that Sarah wanted to protect her from all of this, with every fiber of her being, and the fact that she was still agreeing to this was proof of how much she had learned to trust Telly and her instincts. And so Sarah finally pushed down the door handle, and the two of them walked into the interrogation room together. Kara Brand was already sitting on one of the uncomfortable metal chairs. She looked relaxed, her arms were outstretched on the table, and she was leaning back into her chair. Telly had only caught a small glimpse at her standing in the hallway yesterday, but now, watching her up close, she saw that there was absolutely no resemblance between her and her brother. Where he was all scruffy, always appearing a little absent-minded and rattled, Kara Brand was neat and professional. She was wearing an expensive-looking black pantsuit. Her blonde hair was falling down in soft curls framing her face, and she even had put on bright red lipstick and light makeup. Overall, she looked like she had just gotten ready for a typical day at the office, and not like she had spent the night behind bars. Telly had no idea how she managed to appear so put together, but she figured even in police custody, everything was possible, if you knew the right people and were equipped with the right amount of money. Miss Brand looked up when Tally and Sarah stepped into the room. If she was surprised to see Sarah, or confused by Tally's presence, she didn't show it at all. Instead, her whole body stayed completely relaxed when she smiled at them. A smile that looked nothing but curious, friendly even, and that under different circumstances might have managed to fool Tally. Now, however, things looked slightly different, and while her smile appeared harmless and genuine, Tally was immediately captivated by Kara Brand's eyes. Eyes that couldn't hide the truth. Eyes that told her everything she needed to know about that woman. Eyes that were completely cold, calculating, and bare of any emotion. Tally shivered involuntarily but forced herself to look away and not let this feeling of discomfort that Kara Brand aroused inside of her get to her. She followed Sarah through the room and wordlessly sat down beside her, opposite the blonde woman. It was Sarah who broke the silence and started the conversation. "Miss Brand, I see you didn't bring your lawyer with you." They had known this beforehand, of course. Still, it was probably a smart idea to appear clueless, to make Miss Brand feel superior, like she was in control of this, like she was safe. It was easier to get her to talk if she was feeling like that. If everything would go according to plan, things would change fairly quickly anyway. Fortunately, Sarah's tactics seemed to be working, and for the first time since Detective Bataan had dragged her back into the interrogation room after Tally had exposed her, Kara Brand opened her mouth to talk. "When I was informed it would be you I'd be talking to, I wanted the pleasure of meeting the Detective Sarah Alder all for myself." Then her eyes appraisingly wandered over to Tally, just for a split second, before her complete focus was back on Sarah. "Though I'm a bit disappointed to see that you decided not to show me the same respect." Tally froze. It wasn't Miss Brand's words that startled her, even though they were clearly intended to do just that. No, she was actually pleased to see that her presence had apparently caught the other woman off guard. It was the sound of her voice. The all-too-familiar sound of her voice. It triggered something in Tally's subconsciousness. Everything inside of her screamed at her to run away. Screamed at her that this woman was dangerous, and that Tally had to get away from her as fast as possible. Her breathing quickened slightly, and suddenly she wasn't so sure anymore if doing this, facing that woman, had been such a good idea after all. But then Sarah was there. Or rather, her hand was. Tally felt its light pressure on her knee, felt the warmth it radiated. It was a subtle movement, one that was carefully hidden by the metallic table, and thus went completely unnoticed by Miss Brand and anyone watching them through the two-faced mirror. But somehow that small, feather-like touch was enough to ground her again. Her body relaxed slightly and her breathing evened. When Sarah started to speak, her hand didn't move an inch. "I hope this isn't too much of an inconvenience for you." "Oh, not at all. It's actually such a pleasure to finally meet you in person. I have to say that the pictures aren't doing you justice." "The pleasure is all mine," Sarah replied just as sweetly. Tally didn't like that slightly flirtatious tone in their voices. Oh, she didn't like it at all. But she knew that all of this was just an act. Sarah was just playing Miss Brand's game. Or rather, she was pretending to. Then, before she could put any more thought into the current conversation, the eyes of the blonde woman moved back to Tally, and she felt Sarah's fingers digging almost painfully into her knee in response to the shift of Brand's attention. "Then you must be the reason I ended up here in the first place." Brand addressed Tally, her voice just as warm as it had been with Sarah. Still, Tally didn't miss the almost predatory glance in her eyes, and was once more incredibly grateful for Sarah's presence beside her. "Detective Craven," she introduced herself calmly, purposefully ignoring her taunting. "Now that we are through with the formalities, and you have already mentioned that there's a reason we're getting to enjoy your company, Miss Brand, let's talk a little bit more about this, shall we?" Sarah didn't miss a beat. To turn the focus back to herself, and the effect of her words was immediate. Miss Brand's whole body language changed. She crossed her arms in front of her body and leaned back in her chair, her lips firmly pressed together. "I'm afraid there's not much to tell." You do know why you are here, though, right? For some reason, you think I'm the serial killer you seem to have a very unhealthy obsession with. Pity, really. A woman like you should know better than to suspect someone like me. Sarah managed to keep her smile in place, but Tally knew she was seething inside. And you don't have the faintest idea what made us come to that conclusion? No, Brent firmly replied. So you are saying you are not in any way connected to the Camarilla killer, or have any knowledge about them, other than what was published in the newspaper? That's exactly what I'm saying. Then there was a short moment of silence, and Tally knew that Sarah was doing this on purpose, that she was putting her next words together carefully. She felt her own adrenaline rising. That's unfortunate. We were really hoping for your cooperation, especially now. There's been another murder, you know. A dead woman was found just last night. Sarah's words were hanging in the air for a moment, and Tally kept her eyes focused on Kara Brand. She did her best not to show any reaction, to appear completely unimpressed. But there, for a split second, a shadow washed over her face, a slight twitch of her lips, a small frown, all signs of something that Tally recognized immediately. Surprise, maybe even insecurity. She didn't know about the murder, just like Tally had suspected. The moment, though, was over just as quickly as it had come, and within the blink of an eye, Miss Brand was back to her usual nothing-but-professional self. "Well, why am I still here, then?" she asked bluntly. "This murder was different than the others. We are sure it must have been a person that had been involved with the previous cases. But this time, they have been sloppy, careless even. It was fairly easy to spot, and if you ask me, they didn't do the previous murders justice." There was another carefully calculated pause in which now Sarah was the one seeming completely indifferent, but Tally could see how much she was enjoying this game. So it wasn't much of a surprise when this time we actually found evidence. DNA, to be precise. Someone had apparently forgotten to properly clean the blade that was used to stab the woman. We didn't find a match in our database, but then we noticed that it had some strange similarities with another DNA sample we took recently. Sarah was now speaking very slowly, emphasizing each word, making sure Kara Brand didn't miss a single thing. Yours. And so, we put two and two together and invited your brother over for a friendly little chat. That stupid moron, the blonde woman all but hissed. I knew he would be the one screwing this up. She realized her mistake a second too late and fell silent, but the damage was already done. The words out of her mouth before she had been able to stop herself. Instantly, a small, triumphant grin appeared on Sarah's face. You didn't find anything on the victim, did you? The question was plain and did not necessarily require an answer, but Sarah wouldn't let her off the hook this easily. She had waited too long for this moment. With the smug grin still on her face, she turned to face Kara Brand and replied in the most innocent voice. We didn't, but you just told us everything that we needed to know. Thank you so much for your cooperation, Miss Brand. The blonde woman didn't reply and kept staring straight ahead. Tally could see how she was slowly but surely losing some of her composure. Her face had turned slightly pale, and she grabbed onto the table so tightly that Tally was sure she was trying to hide the fact that her hands had started to shake. But not out of fear or regret. No, Kara Brand was furious. The blonde woman closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, Tally almost didn't recognize the person in front of her. Gone was the professional businesswoman. The indifferent mask, the slightly self-absorbed, yet almost friendly smile. The woman that was now sitting on the chair was still mustering them with an intense gaze, but the way her eyes seemed to turn into completely hollow shells made Tally shiver. Suddenly the whole atmosphere in the room changed. There was a tense quietness, and if she didn't know any better, Tally could have sworn the temperature had dropped a couple of degrees. The only thing that burned was the pure hatred in Kara Brand's eyes. Tally watched the corners of her mouth slowly turn upwards into a smile that was predatory, arrogant, and just purely evil, without the slightest sign of remorse. And at that moment, Tally had no doubt anymore that Kara Brand was the Camarilla killer. This was the smile of a psychopath, someone who enjoyed causing pain, someone who was more than capable to murder 13 women in cold blood. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," Brand threatened in a low whisper. Sarah only chuckled dryly in response. "Oh, please, I'm not afraid of you." "Oh, it's not me you should be afraid of. This is bigger, Sarah. So much bigger." Tally frowned at her words, not quite knowing how to feel about her threat. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to have already made up her mind. "Listen, Kara." She emphasized the woman's first name. "I've spent years playing your silly little games. I've submitted my whole life to you. I've let this grow into an obsession that made me forget everything that truly matters. But I'm done. This is over. You are over. We got you, and there's absolutely nothing left you could do to hurt me." "I wouldn't be so sure about that." Then she tore her eyes away from Sarah, turned her head and looked at Tally once more, the smile still not leaving her face. "Or did you forget about your little plaything here?" "Don't," Sarah all but growled, her voice dangerously low. Miss Brand only laughed in response. "Now what's with the attitude, Sarah? I would have expected you to be a little bit more grateful for the fact that Tally Dearest is still in one piece. Oh, we had such a fun time. Alwyn was quite fond of her, actually. He wanted to keep her so badly, and I usually hate denying him the things that he wants. But we still gave her back to you." Her voice dropped a little now, with her next words addressed Tally directly, made sure that she felt every single one in her bones. "You looked so peaceful lying on that cold stone floor. You didn't even flinch when I painted you. The shade of red of the blood was such a perfect match to your hair. And your skin. Oh, your skin was so soft. It would have been so easy to just take my knife and dig it in. I would have done it so slowly that the pain would have woken you up. I would have let you watch how I moved the knife over your body, starting from your stomach, then over your torso, up until I would have reached that pulsating vein on your neck. Your screams would have sounded like music to my ears, and I would have savored each and every one of them, would have listened to them slowly getting quieter and quieter, until they would have stopped completely when my knife would have found your vocal cords. I could have made you mine, Tally Craven." Tally wanted to reply to this, wanted to laugh into Kara Brandt's face, wanted to tell her how little her words affected her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't. Instead, she sat frozen in place, unable to move, unable to react. Her thoughts were spiraling. Images kept flashing up inside her head. Assumptions, memories, nightmares. The feeling of cold stone underneath her fingers, the sound of heavy breathing, Hurst's strangled laugh, a body leaning over her, fingers ghosting over her face, and then that knife that barely even touched her skin, yet could have ended it all. Flashbacks kept hitting her, one after the other, leaving her no time to recover. It was all too much. Her throat tightened and her pulse was racing. She wanted to get up, wanted to flee out of that room, but she couldn't move, couldn't focus. She tried her usual grounding technique, 5 things she could see: the metal table, Kara Brand, the Camarilla killer, the dagger, the pain, the blood, the panic. It wasn't working. Tally was spiraling again. She felt herself zoning out of the scene, detaching herself from it. It was yet another feeling she was familiar with, a typical response her body had to panic attacks. It was shutting her out in an attempt of protecting her from what she was facing. At that moment, Tally felt like she was no longer in the room. Instead, she was watching the events unfold from the outside. She watched through big eyes how Sarah was on her feet within seconds, watched her rushing around the table, grabbing Kara Brand by her expensive designer jacket and pushing her up against a two-way mirror. She had never seen Sarah lose control like that. Her face was twisted in anger and disgust, and even though Tally was too far gone to fully understand what was happening, Sarah's furious words were ringing in her ears. "She's nobody's but her own." Tally barely registered how the door to the interrogation room was pushed open. She barely noticed Detective Bataan and 2 uniformed officers storming into the room, barely heard Bataan's firm voice urging Sarah that it was enough. Her words actually seemed to reach Sarah, though, and she stepped back, still breathing heavily. She only needed a short moment to pull herself together, then immediately turns towards Tally. Her face no longer filled with anger. Her features softened, worried. Like always, she wanted to make sure Tally was all right. But Tally was far from all right. And before anything else could happen, she was starting to move on autopilot. Mechanically, she got up and took one last look at the woman, who had only needed a couple of words to bring out fears that were buried so deep inside her, she didn't even know they existed. Tally forced herself to straighten her shoulder, then turned around and left the room, slowly and deliberately, with her head held high. Because no matter how much Miss Brand's words had gotten to her, she would under no circumstance give her the satisfaction of showing it. She could hear Sarah and Detective Bataan follow her into the hallway, while the other 2 officers took care of Kara Brand. Tally had thought that everything would fall off of her once she had made it out of the room, away from Miss Brand, whose sheer presence seemed to suffocate her. But when the 2 other women walked towards her, looked at her with concern in their eyes, and tried to talk to her, Tally couldn't follow. She could see their lips moving. Still, their words were not loud enough to drown the static noise in her head. Another wave of panic was approaching quickly and relentlessly. "Excuse me," she mumbled quietly, not sure if Sarah and Bataan could even hear her. Then she stormed off. She didn't know where she was going, but her legs were moving on their own, carrying her to the elevator, up the small staircase to the one place in this building that gave her a strange feeling of security. Sarah's attic. It was already dark outside, and the dim moonlight barely illuminated the room. Still, the quiet atmosphere and the familiarity of the scenery almost immediately calmed Tally down a bit. She walked into the middle of the attic, then stopped and closed her eyes. She couldn't believe that she had been so weak, that her body had reacted in such a strong way. This woman had destroyed all of Sarah's life, had spent years taunting her, mocking her, had killed her sister, the most important person in her life. She would have had every right to break down in front of her, would have had any right to get affected by her words and behavior. Yet it had been Tally who had barely managed to hold it together, and Sarah who had been her tower of strength. God, she was a mess. She had no idea how long she had been standing there like this, her eyes closed, desperate to even her breathing, to calm herself down and get a fucking grip. But eventually she heard the door to the attic open behind her, and without even turning around immediately, she knew that Sarah was there. She could feel her partner stepping behind her, putting her arms around her and pulling her towards her until she was fully pressed against Sarah's body. Tally didn't turn around, didn't want Sarah to see her like this, and for a moment neither of the 2 women spoke. Then Sarah carefully turned her around, and when Tally lifted her head, a single whispered sentence escaped her lips. "I am sorry." "For what?" Sarah replied, sounding genuinely surprised. "That I wasn't strong enough." Understanding flashed over Sarah's face, and she shook her head in disbelief. "Tally, oh, Tally, no. I'm not letting you beat yourself up over this. You've been through so much more than I think you realize. You are not weak. You are incredible. You are brilliant, and you are allowed to feel things. But you cannot forget that you are also human." Sarah wrapped her arms around Tally once more, but even the comfort of her warm embrace couldn't stop her body from shaking and her thoughts from spiraling again. "But I can't, it's been..." The words tumbled out of her mouth, but she just couldn't put them together, couldn't make sense of them. But Sarah seemed to understand anyway. Shh, she silenced Tally. Then she pulled her even closer, and for a while did nothing but hold her. Tally released a shaking sigh, then buried her head in the crook of Alder's neck, breathing her in, taking comfort in her closeness. She felt Sarah move slightly, felt her lips moving over her hair until they were just over her ear. "What can I do?" she murmured, then moved back to give Tally some space. Her eyes found Tally's, silently encouraging her to answer her question. "Just talk to me. Tell me something, anything." Then her eyes subconsciously dropped down to Sarah's lips. "Make me forget, Sarah. Please?" Reluctantly, almost painfully slow, Sarah leaned in. Tally closed her eyes in anticipation, and then for a split second, felt Sarah's lips brush against her own. She wanted to lean into the kiss, wanted to hold on to that feeling it created inside of her, and let it wash away all of the misery that was pulling her down. But Sarah was already pulling away again. When Tally opened her eyes, Sarah's face was still only inches away from her own. She could feel her rigid breath on her face, could see the struggle in her eyes. "Tally, I don't want to take advantage. You are clearly upset, and I'm not sure. I need this. I need you," Tally interrupted her. "Touch me, Sarah. Please, I'm not going to break. I am already broken. Your touch is probably the one thing that can fix me." Tally didn't say the last words out loud. She didn't have to. It seemed like with Sarah she never had to. The woman always knew, always understood. And so when Tally locked eyes with her again, Sarah seemed to see something inside of them that made the rest of her self-control disappear. She pulled Tally forward, leaned in, and this time captured Tally's lips in a kiss that felt nothing but real and unrestrained. It told her everything she needed to hear. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't stupid. She was wanted. Tally whimpered at the contact, and at that moment, Sarah's lips on her own were the only thing that mattered. She didn't waste another thought on Kara Brand, or her panic attack, or the fact that she was technically currently making out with her partner at their workplace, and that despite the late hours and the secluded attic, someone could technically walk in on them any time. Nothing of this mattered. There was only Sarah. Sarah, who had started to let her hands roam over Tally's body. Sarah, who made her gasp when the palm of her hand softly brushed against her breasts. Sarah, whose moan went straight to Tally's core when she playfully bit onto her lower lip. Sarah, who pulled away slightly to look at Tally through dark, lust-clouded eyes, then let her lips wander over Tally's ear. This is a terrible idea. But she was right. She was so right. They should stop. They really should. But she only pressed her body closer against Sarah's, and then her partner opened her mouth again, and Tally's mind went blank. I think you wanted to tell me more about those dreams you had. She all but purred. Tally's breath hitched in response, and she felt her cheeks heating up. Those dreams had been a lot, and no matter how comfortable she was around Sarah by now, giving her a detailed description of her sex dreams was not entirely within her comfort zone. Her eyes grew wide, and she remained silent. Her body, however, decided to betray her once again, and for a split second, her eyes flickered to the table behind Sarah. And Sarah noticed. Of course she did, because when did this woman ever miss a thing? She chuckled lowly. Well, it seems like our dreams were not so different after all. Then her lips were back on Tally's, and she used her body to slowly navigate her through the room until Tally's back made contact with the hard wood of the desk. A surprised yelp escaped her when suddenly Sarah's hands were on her hips, and she effortlessly lifted her up and onto the table. She instinctively opened her legs so that Sarah could slip her thigh between them, and was suddenly very glad that the table was steadying her. Grateful for the opportunity, Tally pressed her lower body against Sarah's thigh and released a small moan at the contact. Then she shifted her weight slightly, groaning at the sensation that movement created between her legs, and her fingers started to impatiently reach for the buttons of the blouse Sarah was wearing. She needed to feel Sarah's skin under her fingers, and the constant pressure of her thigh against her center was slowly starting to drive her crazy. Sarah, however, seemed to have other plans. Gently, yet firm, she pushed Tally further back onto the table, so that she was now forced to use both hands to support herself. Sarah leaned in and started to speak with that husky voice that was almost enough to undo Tally completely. "This is about you, remember? So please, let me make you feel good." Then her hands were back on Tally. She started to caress her breasts through the thin fabric of her shirt, teasingly letting one of her fingers slip underneath the fabric, inside her bra, letting it brush against her nipple. Tally closed her eyes and felt her head falling back. God, this was torture. Sarah took advantage of her now fully exposed neck and planted kisses along her jawline, then moved lower, gently biting down on Tally's pulse point, drawing another long moan from her. "So tell me, is this what you were dreaming about?" "Yes," Tally managed to press out. Sarah's lips wandered even lower, past the fabric of her shirt, biting down hard enough on the soft skin above Tally's breast to surely leave another mark. At that moment, Tally really couldn't care less. What did I do next? Her hands were back on Tally's breasts now, teasing her, making it almost impossible for her to focus on anything else than the feeling of Sarah's hands on her body. "Fuck," Tally groaned, no longer able to form a coherent sentence. "Yeah, I bet I did." Sarah's chuckled reply came almost immediately. Tally was now desperate, trying to push her core closer against Sarah's thigh. She needed to get rid of that goddamned friction, or else she would implode. But Sarah noticed her struggle and purposefully stepped back slightly, making Tally gasp in frustration. "You need to tell me, Tally. Tell me what I did, or else I won't be able to help you out here." Evil. This woman was pure evil, but she had Tally by her throat. Not literally, sadly, but there would be time for that eventually. Right now, she would have probably shared her deepest and darkest secrets with her, to get the release she was craving so badly. So she pulled herself together enough to open her eyes and hiss through gritted teeth. "Your tongue, goddess. You kneeled down and used your tongue." "Used it how?" "Sarah," Tally groaned, when just at that moment she took one of her nipples between her fingers, making Tally forget why she had been so self-conscious in the first place. "You fucked me with your tongue until I was screaming your name." "Good girl," Sarah hummed approvingly. And then, finally, her hand was fidgeting with the button of Tally's jeans. She did quick work, and within seconds had pulled it down. Her panties followed right behind. Then Sarah placed her hands on Tally's hips and pulled them forward and off the table, so that she was now standing on the ground, her back pressed against it. "I want you to look at me. Don't tear your eyes away from me." With that, Sarah slowly dropped onto her knees. Tally could only nod in response, then immediately struggled to follow her order to keep her eyes open, when Sarah placed teasing kisses on her stomach, torturously slow. Her mouth wandered lower, over her pubic mound, brushed against the soft curls between her legs, and ultimately reached its destination. Tally's whole body shivered, and the strangled whimper escaped her when Sarah's tongue darted out and started to move through the wetness she found between her folds, all the way up to Tally's throbbing clit. "You taste so good," Sarah moaned deeply, and Tally thought she would die right here and now. Then, however, Sarah's tongue started to draw small, firm circles around her center, and Tally's mind was completely empty. She kept her eyes open and watched Sarah eat her out, not blinking once, eager to please the older woman. Her fingers dig into the wood of the desk, desperate to hold on to something that would ground her. But it wasn't enough. Nothing seemed to be enough. And soon Tally felt like she was flying. Her moans grew louder and louder, suddenly very glad that the floor below them was completely abandoned. Under different circumstances, she would have been mortified, but when she saw how much Sarah was enjoying every sound she made, how much it seemed to turn her on, she stopped holding back completely. Soon her breathing got quicker and shallower, and she felt her body starting to tense up. Sarah seemed to notice a change in Tally's body as well. She lightly sucked on Tally's clit, then started to quicken her movements. She looked up and locked her gaze with Tally. "Come for me, Tally," she breathed against her. And Tally did. Her orgasm washed over her with a force that, without Sarah's strong hands holding her in place, she was pretty sure she would have just slipped down to the ground. Her legs were shaking, her fingers probably bruised from grabbing the desk so tightly, her whole body overly sensitive to the slightest touch. When she had finally managed to come down from her high, Sarah was already standing in front of her again, a teasing grin on her face. "I hope I did your dream justice." In response, Tally simply pulled her in for another kiss, and when she could taste herself on Sarah's lips, she almost came all over again. Goddess, what was this woman doing to her? Tally pushed herself off the table, quickly put on her pants, then turned around to face Sarah, a mischievous glimmer in her eyes. "I don't know about you," she reached for Sarah's hand, "but I desperately need to get out of here. I'm sure there are a couple of more dreams we need to have a detailed discussion about." "Now that's an idea I can totally get behind," Sarah replied. And together they made their way out of the police department, leaving behind the woman that had tried her best to pull them apart, but in the end had only pushed them closer together, leaving behind Sarah's tragic past, the pain and the misery she had to go through. They were done with all of this. They caught the Camarilla killer. They solved the case. And there was absolutely nothing that would threaten their happiness anymore. Or so they thought. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.